Welcome back once again to the hashtag Make Procurement Awesome with SAP Ariba podcast. I'm Scott Pezza, Director of Financial Supply Chain Research here in our Network Value organization. Today, we're picking back up with our conversation with Veronica Wills from the Hackett Group, focusing on DPO. Now, Veronica, last time around, we jumped into Hackett's 2017 Working Capital Survey, highlighting the starring role of DPO improvement in the overall story of improvement in the cash conversion cycle. Then we turn to your framework for evaluating the maturity of payables organizations. You'd mentioned first looking at the efficiency of payables processes, looked at identifying the source of any gaps in the process, whether they could be attributed to the buy or the sell side of the relationship. Then we talked about new payment terms, and you began looking at supplier segmentation and how that affects how you communicate your project. So that's the background. I'm hoping you're up for picking up right where we left off.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then moving on from that, so I talked a little bit about payment term benchmarking. Some organizations prefer to just go with one single standard term across all of their categories of spend. We don't necessarily support this in our own methodology. There are, of course, exceptions. Maybe this is something that would be less disruptive to your supplier base or easier to manage from a project perspective, or maybe there isn't that many differences between your spend categories. So there are reasons that you might go with a single type of term, but we prefer to actually benchmark by spend category what we think we could achieve, which means there's going to be some upside and there's also going to be some downside. But the importance of evaluating that downside is you're probably going to be more successful negotiating something that is lesser than your middle target term. That is going to better position you for the supplier to take that request seriously. And this is especially important when we're looking at the strategic supplier base, less so with the tactical suppliers. But from a strategic supplier standpoint, you want to understand what are they going to be open to discussing. Otherwise, they're going to do something like either say no outright, or they might try to account for the difference in the terms or the extra days by doing something like increasing the price, which would be a negative result of this type of effort. So once we've gone through the benchmarking process, then we try to figure out what is our suite of terms going to be and who are we going to approach with what. And this allows us to really maximize our levels of success, as I had mentioned, as well as the amount of cash flow improvement that we can actually achieve.
And I think that makes a lot of sense. It's really smart because you're using data analysis, using segmentation, targeting, but it's really about understanding the suppliers, understanding their positions, what they're going to find attractive, overall to increase your success rate. So that way of approaching it. Really intelligent.
It is absolutely a key enabler of success. As you can imagine, it doesn't make sense to treat all of your customers the same. By the same token, it certainly doesn't make sense to treat all of your suppliers the same. And one of the key differentiators is really leverage. And that comes through in our segmentation. I mean, that's a key point of criteria that we use to understand and to classify suppliers correctly in terms of the way that we're going to negotiate and exactly what sort of improvement we're trying to achieve. So once you've gone through that exercise, then the hard part happens, and this is where the negotiations actually take place. So with the customers that you're having to have some sort of a direct negotiation with, there's the effort then of actually performing those discussions, and this can be a bit time intensive because there are things such as contract expiry dates that you need to be aware of and considering your time frame. Now the next bucket of suppliers, which I had alluded to, the tactical group of suppliers, these are usually mid-sized and we have a bit more leverage over them and are primary recipients for letter communication. Given that there's not quite as much value opportunity, it's still substantial and it's certainly going to move the needle on DPO, but it's not quite as substantial as our strategic suppliers for which we want to have that face-to-face discussion. But for these tactical suppliers, letter is appropriate here. Again, you want to be as inclusive as you can with the amount of information that you're communicating to them. But the bonus is once you've made that communication and you've set up a supplier help desk, if you will, to kind of manage any incoming queries or concerns, giving them an appropriate period of time, like 30 days, and then updating your vendor master right away at that point with the new terms by supplier, which could be different, right, is going to allow you to realize a bulk of the benefit almost immediately. So it's a much faster path to benefits. It's not as substantial, as I say, as the strategic segment of customers. However, it is a nice cash boost, and it's a proof of concept, so to speak. And then we've got our last group of suppliers, which is tactical. These are the very many thousands of suppliers that typically make up a small percentage of your spend. The approach here is a little bit different. Typically what we want to do for them is, one, think about supplier rationalization and consolidation. Do we really need to have these many tail suppliers? Can we consolidate and thus use a bigger relationship, more spend with a single supplier to as leverage to negotiate better terms? And the other thing we might want to do with these tail suppliers is just move them all onto P card. It's usually not a good use of time to try to negotiate with this huge group one by one, or even through some sort of letter communication, a terms extension, because they are typically the ones that are either the most dependent on cash flow, or they just happen to be the noisiest. They're not doing a lot of business with you in the first place, and they don't hesitate to really reach out and say that they're not comfortable with that. So it's not worth the noise, let's put it that way. Instead, it just makes sense to try to gain the extra days through leveraging a P card for payment, and at the same time maximizing the rebate that you'd be receiving by exercising your use of the card.
And those are some great ideas, really thinking more broadly about working capital, but even beyond. So it's not just thinking in terms of alternative payment methods, right, to kind of put the long tail onto a card. But you had also referenced what's really more of a sourcing or a supplier selection activity of taking the opportunity of re-examining your working capital, which typically we think about from, say, the accounts payable perspective. But you're thinking about that also as supplier rationalization, which would be more the procurement mindset. So I really like that idea of thinking about these things holistically, that these aren't silos, it's one organization, and the intelligent way of going about this is not losing track of the different levers you have to play with.
That's absolutely right. And we don't pursue cash at the expense of cost. In all of our negotiations and all of our evaluations and assessments, we always come back to the trade-off. Does it make sense to pursue these number of days at the expense of potentially losing our early pay discount, or at the expense of potentially receiving some sort of a pricing increase? So case by case, we have to calculate that trade-off. Now, with procurement being typically incentivized on cost, and we talked about this in one of the earlier podcasts, they're not always of the mindset to be able to evaluate the trade-off between cost and working capital, right? How do you value days? So one of the key tools that we like to implement as part of this this type of program is a trade-off model, where you can input various criteria of the deal, and it'll tell you, does it make sense to pursue these number of days? Does it need to be a higher number of days in the payment term? Or would we be better off just taking the discount or leaving the relationship the same? So it evaluates all the different elements of the negotiation and gives you an answer or response, which kind of takes a little bit of the guesswork and the gut feel out of that process.
That's great. It kind of reduces it to the sort of economic value add or a like-for-like comparison of what do days get you, what's the balance sheet, the cash flow impact for those things versus impacting your, say, cost of goods when you're buying. So it's nice that you have a tool to make that comparison, so it isn't just an ad hoc or off the cuff sort of feel for what it is, and you've got some math behind it.
That's right. And when we talk to prospective clients that have maybe undergone this type of process themselves, for us, really what's missing are these key elements of methodology.
I think so far, kind of interspersed with some of the talk of the sort of evolutionary steps, we've covered a lot of best practices. A lot of the things that companies should be doing and should think about doing if they're not currently, to get up to speed and to really make the most out of these opportunities. Now, I know one additional thing that we wanted to talk about, and I want to do this before we close out, was one aspect in particular, and that was supply chain finance. We referenced it a little bit in saying that it's an opportunity for a buyer to extend DPO without necessarily having a DSO impact on their supplier, and in many situations can be quite a nice proposition for suppliers, giving them access to cash at far preferable rates to what they might have on the open market, say through lines of credit or different sorts of sell-side financing. So I'm interested in sort of your take on supply chain finance, where it is in the market, and how it's impacting our cash conversion cycle analysis.
Yes, absolutely. This is really the next phase of maturity or evolution, if you will, in the elevation of the supplier payment practices that we've been talking about. We kind of looked at what is the organization's ability to process the invoices, the transactions efficiently? Is there a process in place to manage any exceptions within a kind of defined time period enabled by workflow? We talked about then looking at what sort of terms can we extend to our suppliers and what's the most effective way of achieving those. How do we incorporate P-card into that process? And now that leads us very nicely into supply chain financing. So we've done everything we can at a high level from a internal process improvement and control over things like terms and conditions. There's still going to be a portion of the supplier base where we're not achieving benefit from, or we haven't maximized our benefit and our control over DPO and payment term days, or we may have done everything that we can, but we still have some sort of a cash requirement that we can't quite achieve. Supply chain financing comes in here very nicely. Very little cost to the organization once you've got everything set up, and this allows the supplier to make kind of an informed decision on their end as to, do they want to leverage the supply chain financing to get paid faster at the expense of providing some sort of a discount, which would vary just depending on the accelerated time schedule for payment and or any other agreement that happens to be in place. So this is part of a mature organization's end-to-end supplier payment strategy for sure, and I would say that it has picked up significantly in popularity and use and appeal in the last 2 or 3 years as companies are getting wiser about what they can do to manage this element or aspect of working capital.
I agree. I think that's a lot of what we see as well. Because the approach to supply chain finance follows pretty closely with some of the analysis and segmentation we talked about before. It's true here. There's a little bit more legwork or more paperwork involved. So this isn't the long tail. You're not looking at say 50,000 suppliers. You're really looking at some big core vendors. And here you've got say some more segmentation when you're looking at credit scores, right? Because what you really want to do is take advantage of a buyer's superior credit to make attractive offers to those suppliers. Now, one thing that you said, and I think it's interesting, we see more interest picking up and then seeing that sort of distinction between how much DPO has gone up without impacting DSO as much is another way of thinking about supply chain finance. So one is the impact on your own organization from a financial standpoint. But I think it's really important to also consider supplier health, right? So if you think of those strategic suppliers, if you think about the health of your supply chain finance is a really cool mechanism to sort of shore up suppliers. So it's more of a risk play, right? Like you're reducing risk in your supply chain when you think about things like fulfillment risk, making sure these suppliers on whom you rely, they're healthy enough to produce and deliver the sort of things that you're relying on. So it's a really nice way of combining what would typically be a risk-focused supplier health point of view with, not a bad impact on your financials either. All right. Well, I think at this point that's all the time we have for today's episode. I want to say a big thank you to Veronica Wills of the Hackett Group for taking some time to chat today.
Absolutely. I have to say as well, wanted to tell you I am an avid listener of your podcast. I think it's been hugely informational to me from a professional standpoint. So I've really enjoyed the work that you have been doing.
Well, thank you for that. And we certainly look forward to having our friends from Hackett back once again in the near future. I also want to say thank you to everyone listening to this episode of the hashtag Make Procurement Awesome with SAP Ariba podcast. If you like what you've heard, be sure to subscribe to the podcast, either on iTunes or on Google Play. And if you'd like more information about SAP Ariba, you can visit us online at ariba.com. Have a great day.